These dishes saved thousands of families from starvation in the unforgiving desert. The pioneers of the Wild West created food from literally nothing, from what grew under their feet, swam in muddy rivers, or ran across the prairies. Each recipe was a matter of life and death, where one mistake could cost the entire family their lives. In conditions where the nearest store was hundreds of kilometers away and money was only enough for the bare necessities, ingenuity became the main ingredient in any dish. These people turned weed roots into bread and animal bones into nutritious soup that could sustain them for weeks.
It's a long way we've come.
Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary grass helped entire settlements survive and why one cornmeal dish was called the savior of the West. What if I told you that there was a type of bread that could be stored for decades without refrigeration? Hardtack was the staple food of any pioneer heading west. This simple product, made from flour, water, and salt, saved more lives than any other dish of that era. It could be eaten raw, soaked in water, or fried with lard. The recipe was ridiculously simple. 2 cups of flour, 3/4 of a cup of water, and a teaspoon of salt. The dough was rolled out to a thickness of about 1 centimeter and cut into palm-sized squares. Rows of holes were made in each square, with a nail or awl. Hardtack was baked in an oven or on hot stones by the fire until completely dry. Properly cooked bread became hard as a rock and could be stored for years in a dry place. Moisture was its main enemy. Dampness caused it to become moldy and unfit for consumption. Eating this bread dry was a challenge for the teeth. Settlers usually soaked it in coffee, water, or broth until it softened. Some preferred to crumble hardtack into porridge or soup, where it served as a thickener and source of carbohydrates. Its main advantage was its incredible practicality for travel. Hardtack did not take up much space, weighed almost nothing, and provided the body with energy for a long time. The pioneer's wagon always contained several bags of this eternal bread. Experienced travelers learned to cook a variety of dishes from hardtack. They fried it with bacon, made puddings with molasses, or turned it into breadcrumbs for meat. This versatility made it an indispensable product. The quality of hardtack depended on the quality of the flour and storage conditions. The best bread was made from premium wheat flour, but in times of shortage, any available flour was used. Corn flour produced a more crumbly but no less nutritious result. Over the course of its existence, hardtack has been given many nicknames. Soldiers called it toothbreaker, sailors called it ship's biscuit, and settlers simply called it hard bread. All of these names reflected its main characteristic, its incredible hardness. Despite its simple composition, hardtack required a certain skill to prepare. Underbaked bread quickly spoiled, and overbaked bread became inedible. Experienced housewives could determine its readiness by the sound it made. Properly baked hardtack rang when tapped. This humble dish became a symbol of survival for American pioneers. It proved that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most reliable and effective. Thank you for watching. Where are you watching us from? What interested you most about the history of this amazing bread? Ready to learn a secret that Native Americans have passed down for centuries? Pemmican was the real superfood of the Wild West, a concentrated source of energy that could sustain a person for months. Pioneers quickly adopted this recipe from Native American tribes, realizing its incredible value for survival in harsh conditions. The basis of pemmican was carefully dried meat, most often bison, deer, or moose. The meat was cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or over a fire until it became brittle. This process could take several days, but the result was worth it. The dried meat was ground into powder using stones or wooden pestles. Melted fat, usually bear or bison, was added to the meat powder in a ratio of about 1:1. The fat served as a preservative and a source of calories. Dried berries were added to the mixture to improve the taste and nutritional properties. Cranberries, blueberries, or cherries, which grew in abundance on the plains, were most often used. The berries not only added a pleasant sweet and sour taste, but also provided the body with vitamins. The finished mixture was formed into brick-sized briquettes and wrapped in animal skins for storage. In this form, pemmican could remain edible for a year or more. It was not affected by heat, cold, or humidity. The nutritional value of pemmican was fantastic. Just 100 grams of this product provided the body with 450 to 500 calories, complete proteins, and fats. It was the perfect food for people who walked or rode all day long. Pemmican could be eaten on its own or as part of other dishes. It was crumbled into soup, dissolved in hot water to make a nutritious broth, or simply chewed like modern energy bars. The taste was distinctive, but to a hungry person it seemed like a delicacy. The pioneers learned to prepare different versions of pemmican depending on the ingredients available. Instead of bison meat, they used beef or pork, and instead of wild berries, they used raisins or dried apples. The main thing was to maintain the right proportions of meat and fat. Fur traders and explorers considered pemmican their main ally on long expeditions. One bag of this concentrated food could provide a person with food for a month of travel. This freed up space in their luggage for other necessary items. Making high-quality pemmican required experience and patience. It was important to dry the meat completely to prevent spoilage and to calculate the amount of fat correctly. Too little fat and the product would spoil quickly. Too much and it would become rancid. This ancient dish became a bridge between the cultures of Native Americans and European settlers. It showed that survival in new lands required the adoption of local traditions and knowledge. But are you ready to learn how simple corn flour became the staple food of entire settlements? I discovered this dish by accident in an old cookbook. Johnny cakes got their name from itinerant preachers who cooked them on hot stones by the fire during their missionary travels. These simple corn cakes were a real lifesaver for families who couldn't afford expensive wheat flour. The history of Johnny cakes goes back to Native American tribes who made similar cakes from coarsely ground cornmeal. European settlers adapted the recipe to their own circumstances, creating a dish that could be made in almost any conditions and with a minimal set of ingredients. The classic recipe required only 3 ingredients: cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt. The flour was mixed with hot water until a thick dough was obtained that did not stick to the hands. The consistency had to be such that small cakes about 1 centimeter thick could be formed from the dough. Johnny cakes were cooked on any hot surface. At home, a cast iron skillet or a special baking board was used. When camping, a hot flat stone, previously cleaned and heated over a fire, was suitable. The cakes were fried on both sides until golden brown. The secret to delicious Johnny cakes was the quality of the cornmeal and the temperature of the water. The best results were obtained with medium ground flour, not too fine and not too coarse. The water had to be hot but not boiling, so that the flour would brew well. The basic recipe allowed for many variations depending on the ingredients available. Eggs were added to the dough for extra nutrition, milk or cream for tenderness, and sugar or molasses for sweetness. Sometimes pieces of bacon or lard were mixed into the cakes. Johnny cakes were a versatile dish that was suitable for any meal. In the morning, they were eaten with molasses or honey as a sweet breakfast. At lunchtime, they were served with meat or vegetables as a side dish. In the evening, they were used instead of bread, dipped in soup or stew. The economic benefits of Johnny cakes were obvious even to the poorest families. Cornmeal was several times cheaper than wheat flour, and the corn harvest was more stable and abundant. 1 pound of flour was enough to make enough cakes to feed a family of 6. Guess what dish was eaten almost every day in the Wild West? Beans and bacon was the staple diet of the American frontier. This combination provided the body with all the necessary nutrients and could be prepared in large quantities with minimal time and money. Beans were the perfect food for frontier conditions. They could be stored for a long time without spoiling, were high in protein and fiber, and were filling. Dried beans took up little space in settlers' wagons and cost pennies compared to meat. Bacon served not only as a source of animal protein, but also as fat for cooking. 1 piece of bacon could add flavor to a huge pot of beans, and the rendered fat was used to fry other foods. Smoked bacon could be stored for months without refrigeration. The classic method of preparation began with soaking the beans overnight in cold water. In the morning, the water was drained, the beans were rinsed, and fresh water was added. A piece of bacon was added to a cast iron pot and simmered on low heat for several hours. Slow cooking was the key to the success of this dish. The beans had to be completely softened and infused with the aroma of bacon. The process could take anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, depending on the type of beans and the intensity of the heat. Do you think the pioneers could have imagined that their everyday food would become the basis for modern barbecue recipes? Sourdough bread was a real miracle of baking for the pioneers of the Wild West. In conditions where it was impossible to buy yeast and the nearest store was hundreds of kilometers away, sourdough became a living treasure for every family. It was cherished like the fire in the hearth, passed down from generation to generation. The creation of sourdough starter began with the simplest ingredients: flour and water. The mixture was left in a warm place for several days, stirring periodically. Wild yeast from the air gradually colonized the mixture, starting the fermentation process. After a week, a live culture was formed that was capable of raising bread dough. Caring for the starter required constant attention. It had to be regularly fed with fresh flour and water, and the right temperature and consistency had to be maintained. In cold weather, the pot with the starter was placed closer to the fire, and in hot weather, it was moved to a cool place. Bread making began the night before. Flour, water, and salt were added to the active sourdough starter. The dough was kneaded and left overnight to rise. Slow fermentation gave the bread its characteristic sour taste and dense but soft texture. Sourdough bread was baked in Dutch ovens, cast iron pots with lids. Hot coals were poured into the bottom of the pot. The dough was placed in a mold or directly on the bottom. The lid was placed on top and covered with coals. This design created even heat on all sides. Each starter had its own unique character, depending on the local wild yeast and bacteria. Bread made from a San Francisco starter was different from bread made from a Texas or Montana starter. These differences made each family starter special and unique. Ready to learn about a preservation technique that is thousands of years old? Jerky, or dried meat, was the primary method of preserving protein in the Wild West. This ancient preservation method, borrowed from Native American tribes, allowed meat to remain edible for months without refrigeration or special equipment. The process of making jerky began with selecting the right meat. Lean cuts of beef, venison, or moose with minimal fat were best suited. Fat quickly went rancid and spoiled the entire product, so it was carefully removed with a sharp knife. The meat was cut into thin strips no more than half a centimeter thick. It had to be cut along the grain, which made the finished jerky tougher, but also more resistant to spoilage. Some preferred to cut across the grain to obtain a more tender product. The sliced meat was salted with coarse salt or soaked in a salt solution. The salt drew moisture out of the meat and created an unfavorable environment for bacteria. Some added spices to the brine: black pepper, chili, garlic, or wild herbs to improve the taste. The meat was dried in the open air by hanging strips on wooden frames or ropes. Hot, dry days with a constant wind were ideal conditions. In rainy weather, the meat was dried over a smoldering fire, which gave it additional flavor and protected it from spoilage. The drying process took 1 to 3 days, depending on weather conditions and the thickness of the cuts. The finished jerky was dark brown, tough to the touch, and broke easily when bent. Properly dried meat lost up to 75% of its original weight. Do you think modern people would appreciate the taste of real jerky made according to old recipes? Corn mush, or corn porridge, was perhaps the most democratic dish of the American frontier. It could be made from the cheapest ingredients, was quick to prepare, and satisfied hunger for a long time. For many immigrant families, this simple porridge was the basis of their daily diet. The main ingredient was coarsely ground cornmeal or crushed corn. These products were available almost everywhere on the American continent, were inexpensive, and could be stored for a long time. Unlike capricious wheat, corn grew in a wide variety of climatic conditions. The preparation of porridge began with boiling water in a large pot. When the water began to boil, cornmeal was gradually added to it, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon. The main thing was to avoid lumps, which spoiled the texture of the finished dish. The proportions depended on the desired consistency and the number of eaters. Usually 4 to 5 cups of water were taken for 1 cup of flour. Thick porridge could be cut with a knife, while thin porridge was eaten with a spoon straight from the bowls. Mush was cooked over low heat for half an hour to an hour. Salt was added to the basic recipe to taste, and if possible, milk or cream was added for nutrition and tenderness. The sweet version was prepared with molasses, honey, or sugar. The salty version was served with bacon, lard, or leftover meat. The finished porridge was filling and nutritious. Corn contained carbohydrates for energy, protein for muscle building, and B vitamins for the nervous system. A serving of hot porridge could sustain a worker's strength for half a day. Corn mush was a versatile dish that was suitable for any time of day. In the morning, it was eaten hot as porridge. In the afternoon, it was used as a side dish with meat. And in the evening, it was thickened and cut into pieces to be fried for breakfast the next day. Wild game stew was a dish for lucky hunters and their families. In conditions where domestic meat was expensive and difficult to obtain, game became the main source of animal protein. The ability to cook a tasty and nutritious stew from any animal that was hunted was a vital skill. The game used for stew could be very diverse: venison, moose, bear, rabbit, and wildfowl. Each type of meat had its own cooking characteristics. Large game had to be simmered for a long time to soften the tough fibers, while small game had to be cooked quickly so as not to dry it out. Cooking began with cutting up the prey and cutting the meat into large pieces. Game meat was often tough and lean, so it was first fried in a cauldron with lard or fat. This added flavor to the dish and helped keep the juices inside the pieces. Water or broth was added to the fried meat, brought to a boil, and then the heat was reduced. Long simmering over low heat was the secret to a successful stew. The meat had to become tender and easily separated with a fork, and the broth had to be rich and flavorful. Vegetables were added depending on the season and availability. Potatoes, onions, carrots, turnips, anything that grew in the garden or was stored in the cellar. Wild plants were also used: young fern shoots, wild lily bulbs, burdock roots. The stew was seasoned with salt, pepper, and wild herbs. Wild garlic, thyme, juniper, and other aromatic plants were especially prized. They not only improved the taste, but also helped digest the heavy game meat and mask the specific taste of some animals. The finished stew was very filling and nutritious. Game meat was high in protein and iron, vegetables provided vitamins, and the rich broth warmed you up on cold days. One serving of this stew could replace a full meal. Prairie oysters were one of the most unusual dishes of the American frontier. This poetic name referred to bull testicles, which were considered a real delicacy among cowboys and ranchers. In conditions where no part of a slaughtered animal was wasted, this dish became a symbol of practicality and resourcefulness. The history of prairie oysters began with the need to use every part of the slaughtered cattle. On ranches and farms, nothing was thrown away, even what modern people would consider inedible. Bull testicles were high in protein and considered an aphrodisiac, so they were especially popular. Preparation began with thorough cleaning and preparation of the product. The testicles were freed from their outer shells, washed in cold water, and cut into thick slices. They were then soaked in salted water or buttermilk to remove any specific taste. The classic method of preparation was similar to frying regular cutlets. The slices were coated in flour with salt and pepper, then fried in a pan with lard or vegetable oil. They were fried quickly over high heat to achieve a golden brown crust on the outside and a tender texture on the inside. The finished prairie oysters had a soft, creamy texture and a surprisingly delicate flavor that many compared to veal or chicken. The specific taste that deterred inexperienced eaters completely disappeared with proper preparation and good pretreatment. This dish was served hot, often with fried onions, potatoes, or other vegetables. A popular accompaniment was hot sauce or mustard, which emphasized the delicate flavor of the main ingredient. In cowboy kitchens, prairie oysters were considered a special treat for honored guests. What lies behind the beautiful image of a familiar weed? Dandelion greens were a real lifesaver for pioneer families, especially at the end of winter, when vegetable supplies were running low and scurvy was a threat to health. This weedy plant contained more vitamins than many cultivated plants and grew almost everywhere. Dandelions were one of the first edible plants to appear in the spring. Their young leaves could be picked as soon as the snow melted, providing the body with fresh vitamins after long months of canned and dried food. This was especially important for preventing vitamin deficiency. Picking dandelions required certain knowledge and skill. The best leaves were considered to be the young ones, picked before the plant bloomed. After the yellow flowers appeared, the leaves became bitter and tough. They were picked early in the morning when the leaves had maximum moisture and minimum bitterness. Young dandelion leaves could be eaten raw in salads, mixed with other wild plants or garden greens. They had a slightly bitter but pleasant taste, reminiscent of arugula. Such salads were a source of vitamin C, iron, and other important micronutrients. Most often, dandelion greens were prepared like regular leafy greens. The leaves were washed, coarsely chopped, and stewed with bacon or lard. The fat softened the bitterness and made the dish more satisfying. Adding onions and garlic improved the taste and aroma. For long-term storage, dandelion leaves were dried or salted. Dried greens could be added to soups and stews in winter, providing the body with vitamins during the cold season. Salted leaves retained more vitamins and had a pleasant sour taste. Dandelion roots were also edible and nutritious. They were dug up in the fall when they had accumulated nutrients. The roots could be boiled like potatoes, fried or dried and ground into flour to add to bread. We have looked at 10 foods that were the basis of survival for American pioneers. Each of them tells its own story of how people adapted to the harsh conditions of the Wild West, turning the simplest ingredients into sources of vital energy. These recipes demonstrate the amazing ingenuity of our ancestors. They knew how to find food where modern man would see only wasteland. They turned waste into delicacies and weeds into medicines and vitamins. The history of pioneer nutrition is a lesson in modesty, practicality, and respect for food. Every crumb was worth its weight in gold, and every ingredient was used in its entirety. These principles are still relevant today, reminding us of the value of simple, honest food. Which of these dishes did you find most surprising? Would you be able to try prairie oysters or bake sourdough bread? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn more amazing stories from the past.